So our worksheet today is going to help us think a bit more about the story of Pharaoh and God and Moses and these plagues, these signs that God sends to warn the Egyptians and show that God is the one who is in charge. He's stronger than Pharaoh. Worksheet looks like this, and have a go at it. Have a read through the story in Exodus, so the second book in the Bible, chapter 7. It's quite a long bit we're reading today, but do have a read through. Get familiar with the story, and then have a go at filling in the worksheet. And the first question is, draw a picture of the 11 miraculous signs that happen in this story. So I've had a go at drawing them on my whiteboard here. Now, if I can draw these, I'm sure you can. Your drawing is going to be much better than mine. But we've got the first sign that happened in the palace, where Aaron's stick became a snake and ate up all the other snakes. Then we have the plagues of turning the water into blood, the frogs, the gnats, the flies, the animals dying, the boils, the salt bits on people's skin, the hailstones and the lightning, the locusts that ate everything up, the darkness, and then the death. The final plague that God warns Moses about in chapter 11, that the oldest boy in each family and the oldest animal will die. So those are the plagues, the signs that God sends on Egypt. Then we've got some questions to think about. How do the plagues show God's kindness? And there are some verses there to look up. And they're showing us that God, through Moses, warns Pharaoh in Egypt before these terrible things happen. If Pharaoh had said, okay, I will let your people go, God, these terrible things wouldn't have happened. God warns Pharaoh and gives him a chance to change every time. But Pharaoh doesn't. So we see that God's kind as he warns Pharaoh what's going to happen before he does it. And we see that God's really kind to his people. God's people, the Israelites, don't suffer like the Egyptians do. God is really kind, even when he is punishing Egypt for all the wrong things that they've done. How do the plagues show God's power? That's the second question down to think about. Well, they show that God is the one who's in charge, because only God, the creator of everything, could do these miracles. No one else could make it go dark in one part of Egypt for 3 days. That can't happen. No one can do that by themselves. No one else can. It shows that God's got the power to control what's happening. He can make the winds blow locusts in, and the winds can change and blow all the locusts away, but God's in control of that. We see that God's the powerful one, not Pharaoh. God is the one who's got the power to do all this. How do the plagues show the hardness of Pharaoh's heart? After every little story of these plagues in the Bible, we read something about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. And that's what sin does. Sin is when we're not living God's way and our heart doesn't want to listen to what God's saying. We keep doing something different. And Pharaoh's heart remains hard, is kept hard during everything that's going on, showing that he is going against God rather than going God's way. Hard heart against God. That's what Pharaoh's heart is like. Then we've got some questions to think about ourselves, because that's the thing, these worksheets are not meant to be like a test from school, but they're just meant to help us think about what we read in the Bible, because we're not just meant to read our Bibles to get lots of knowledge in our heads. It's to help us live our lives more and more Jesus' way. So we need to think about what it means for us. So the first question, how do we sometimes also refuse to do what God asks? Remember, God was asking Pharaoh to let God's people go and he wouldn't let them. How are we sometimes like that? Well, God shows us the way to live. He tells us the best way of living. And often we do completely opposite. God says to put himself first, to put him first in everything. But often I put myself first. I do what I want to do, what makes me feel happy, what makes me more comfortable, rather than what pleases God. Or God tells us to care for other people more than ourselves. Well, I mean, again, I put myself first. I'd rather be comfortable and happy myself rather than caring about others. So there's lots of ways, and I'm sure you can think of lots of ways in your life too, that we refuse to do what God says. We don't want to go God's way. We'd rather go our own way. How does this show what our hearts are like? Well, again, it shows us that our hearts are hard. Our hearts are hard against God, pushing Him away and going our own way and being stubborn in that. We don't want to listen to what God has to say because our hearts are hard and set against Him. Is it right that God punishes this kind of rebellion? Rebellion just means going against God. Is it right that God punishes this? Well, yes. It sounds really harsh and really horrible. But remember, God created the world. He knows what's best. He knows the right way of living and the wrong way of living. He says who's right and who's wrong. And it's clear that this is wrong in God's eyes to be living hard-hearted, to be living against God. And He can't let that go unpunished. It wouldn't be fair if He didn't punish that. So yes, God has to punish when people are hard-hearted and going against God rather than going to Him. And the last question is the really good news for us if we're following Jesus. God has punished Jesus for the sins of the world, but it only works for those who trust in Him. How does this show God's power and kindness? Well, it shows that God's power because He has to deal with this thing that's going wrong. He has to punish because it wouldn't be fair if He didn't punish, if He just swept it under the carpet and pretended it didn't happen. It shows God's power because Jesus dies instead of us. It shows that He still cares about right and wrong, that He's powerful. But it shows how kind God is because we don't have to suffer and be punished like the Egyptians do. We don't have to suffer that because Jesus suffered that instead of us. God is so kind that He doesn't want to punish us. So He makes it possible for Him to still be fair, still deal with right and wrong, but not punish us. Instead, by punishing Jesus. And if we're trusting in Jesus, that's why it's such good news. Because He got punished for all the wrong things, for our hard hearts, rather than us getting punished. So that shows that God is really kind. So hopefully that helps us understand a little bit more what this story means and what it means for us if we're following Jesus, and helps us to keep living His way.